Here's an expanded version of Scene 1 with around 1,000 words, keeping the emotional depth and tension intact. The apartment block was old, the kind that had seen better days, with peeling paint and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of damp. The sun had already begun its slow descent, casting a dim golden glow through the cracked windows. Inside her tiny kitchen, Amina sat on the cold, worn linoleum floor, her back pressed against the chipped cabinet. Her hands were folded in her lap, trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the persistent ache in her stomach that had gnawed at her all day. She had skipped breakfast and lunch, hoping to save whatever little food she could scrounge for her daughter, but the cupboards were bare. Her daughter, Sarah, sat cross-legged a few feet away, hugging her knees to her chest. Her small brow was furrowed, and her large, dark eyes shone with the beginnings of tears. "Mama, my tummy hurts," she said softly, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of the gnawing emptiness inside her. She looked at her mother with a mix of fear and hope, unsure if her mother could make the pain go away. Amina forced a smile she didn't feel, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's forehead. "I know, Habibti. I know, soon we'll eat. Just a little longer, okay." She said the words, but they felt hollow even to her own ears. She had wanted to shield Sarah from this reality, to keep her safe from hunger and despair, but the truth was inescapable. There was nothing at all. She rose slowly and walked over to the cupboards, pressing her palms against the cold, empty shelves. Her fingers traced the wood as if willing something to appear, but only emptiness greeted her touch. Her chest tightened, her mind racing. How had it come to this? How had she, someone who had always tried to manage, always tried to stretch every last coin, ended up with nothing for her child? Sarah whimpered, breaking the silence. Amina's heart ached. She sank back down to the floor beside her daughter, gathering her into a protective embrace. "It's okay, Habibti. Mama's here," she whispered, rocking her gently. She tried to ignore the knot of panic forming in her stomach, telling herself she could endure it. She had gone without before, endured hunger before, but seeing her child's small frame shake with need was unbearable. Down the hall, in the apartment next door, Mrs. Karim returned from the market, her arms full of fresh vegetables, a few loaves of bread, and some cans of beans. The elderly woman set her shopping down and began sorting through her purchases, humming quietly to herself. But then she paused. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of soft crying, fragile and pitiful, a child's cry that tugged at her heart. It was faint, almost lost in the building's creaking walls, but it was unmistakable. Her knuckles rapped gently on Amina's door, hesitant at first. "Amina, are you there?" she called softly. When no answer came, only another small whimper, concern flared in her chest. "Sarah," she said, her voice filled with gentle worry. Still, no response. Something told her to act, to step beyond politeness. She tried the door handle, it wasn't locked. With a deep breath, she stepped inside, her eyes immediately taking in the scene before her. Amina sat hunched over on the floor, her hands in her lap, her head bowed. Beside her, Sarah clung to her mother, tears streaming down her small cheeks. The dim light from the single window illuminated the hollowness of the apartment, a chipped table with nothing on it, a chair with a torn cushion, and cupboards that echoed emptiness. Mrs. Karim's heart tightened at the sight. Hunger, fear, and despair hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Oh, Amina," she whispered, her voice catching. She hurried to the small kitchen, pulling from her shopping bag a few loaves of bread, a small carton of milk, and some beans. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked gently, kneeling beside them. Amina looked up, shame flashing in her eyes, and her lips quivered. I didn't want to bother anyone. I thought I could manage." Mrs. Karim shook her head softly. "You're not bothering anyone, Amina. Look at your baby, look at her. You can't let her go hungry. Let me help." She handed a slice of bread to Sarah, who hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was real, and then took it with a tentative, grateful smile. Her small hands clutched it tightly, and her eyes sparkled with a light that had almost been extinguished. Amina watched, tears stinging her own eyes. She had tried to be strong, to shield Sarah from the harshness of their life, but in doing so, she had carried the burden alone until now. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, relief, gratitude, and the sudden realization that she was not as alone as she had feared. Mrs. Karim set the food down on the small table and began preparing a simple meal. She opened the beans, poured the milk into a cup, and tore the bread into small pieces. Sarah's tiny hands reached out eagerly, and Amina helped her, her own stomach still empty but no longer the primary focus. She watched her daughter's face light up with each bite, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe. As they ate together, Mrs. Kareem spoke softly, filling the room with her presence, her calmness, and her care. She reminded Amina that no one had to face such struggles alone, that neighbors, friends, and family existed to support each other in times of need. Amina nodded, feeling the weight of shame and fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. The apartment, once heavy with silence and despair, now felt warmer, filled with the sounds of quiet munching, soft laughter, and the reassurance of human connection. Amina held Sarah close as she finished her small meal, feeling the first stirrings of hope in weeks. She realized that strength wasn't in facing hunger alone, it was in accepting help, in letting someone else share the burden. By the time the meal ended, Sarah's tears had dried, and her giggles replaced them. Amina smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, as Mrs. Kareem cleaned up and prepared to leave. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what I was going to do." Mrs. Kareem squeezed her shoulder gently. "No one should have to face that alone. Tomorrow, we'll make sure you have enough. And the next day, too. You're not alone, Amina. Never again." For the first time that day, Amina believed her. As she tucked Sarah into bed that night, the child's stomach full and her spirit lifted, Amina felt a flicker of hope. She could endure hardship, yes, but she no longer had to endure it in isolation. She could breathe, just a little, knowing that kindness existed, and that sometimes, all it took was one caring neighbor to change the course of a difficult day. This version delves deeper into Amina's emotions, the environment, and Mrs. Kareem's observations, expanding it to roughly 1,000 words while maintaining the tension and emotional core. If you want, I can also expand scene 2 to 1,000 words to match this level of detail. Do you want me to do that next? Here's an expanded version of scene 2 at roughly 1,000 words, continuing from where scene 1 left off. The evening had settled into a calm hush, the kind that comes after a storm passes. The tiny apartment, once weighed down by emptiness and quiet despair, now felt alive with warmth. Sarah lay on the threadbare mattress, her small body sprawled comfortably, the slice of bread and a few sips of milk having filled her belly for the first time that day. She yawned, rubbing her eyes with chubby fists, her earlier cries now replaced by soft, contented giggles. Amina sat cross-legged on the floor beside her daughter, watching her sleep. For a long moment, she simply breathed, allowing herself to absorb the quiet after so many hours of tension. She could still feel the lingering ache in her stomach, but it had faded slightly, replaced by a new sensation, relief. Relief that Sarah would not go to bed hungry, relief that someone had answered her silent call, relief that the weight of her isolation had been lifted, even if only for a moment. Across the small living space, Mrs. Kareem moved about, tidying the kitchen with gentle efficiency. She placed the remaining food neatly in the cupboard and wiped down the small table that had held their modest meal. Amina watched her, a quiet admiration rising in her chest. This woman, older and seemingly fragile, had entered their lives and brought with her a sense of order, kindness, and calm that Amina hadn't realized she'd been starving for as much as she had been for food. "You've been hiding your struggles for too long, Amina," Mrs. Kareem said gently, settling into the worn chair at the table. Her eyes, soft but steady, met Amina's. "Thinking you have to bear it all alone doesn't make you strong. It only makes the burden heavier." Amina lowered her gaze, feeling the sting of shame but also the relief of honesty. "I was afraid that if anyone knew, they'd think I failed as a mother. I didn't want Sarah to feel ashamed, or to see me weak." Her voice quivered, the words carrying the weight of exhaustion, fear, and the vulnerability she had carried for far too long. Mrs. Kareem reached across the table, placing a warm, steady hand over Amina's. "Your daughter doesn't need a perfect home. She doesn't need to see you pretending everything is fine when it's not. She needs you fed, safe, and loved. And that's exactly what you are. Sometimes, asking for help is the strongest thing you can do." Amina felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. For so long, she had believed that strength meant enduring in silence, carrying every burden alone. But now, sitting here with her daughter content and a neighbor who genuinely cared, she realized that strength also meant accepting help, letting others share the weight of hardship, and trusting that kindness could exist in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. Sarah stirred in her sleep, murmuring something incomprehensible before stretching her tiny arms over her head. Amina's hand instinctively moved to smooth her daughter's hair, feeling the softness that had been almost forgotten in the anxiety of the day. Sleep well, my little one, she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to Sarah's forehead. Mrs. Kareem smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She's a brave little girl, just like her mother. And brave girls deserve to know the world isn't always harsh. There are good people too, people who care. Amina nodded, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. She thought of the countless times she had imagined a life where Sarah never felt the pangs of hunger, where she could provide everything her child needed without struggle. That life felt distant, almost unattainable, yet in this small moment, she realized that it was the simple acts of kindness that mattered most: a loaf of bread, a warm word, a hand extended in help. These small gestures could transform desperation into hope. Mrs. Kareem stood and moved to the window, drawing aside the thin curtain to look out at the city lights twinkling in the night. Tomorrow, she said softly, we'll make sure there's enough food for you both. And the day after that, and the day after that. You don't have to face hunger alone, ever again. Amina watched her, overwhelmed with gratitude. She wanted to speak, to tell Mrs. Kareem how much her words meant, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. Instead, she simply nodded, letting the weight of relief wash over her. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. The apartment settled into a gentle quiet. Sarah slept peacefully, the small chest rising and falling with each breath, and Amina felt an unfamiliar peace settle over her. She thought about the struggles that lay ahead, the bills she still had to pay, the uncertainties of tomorrow, but for now, those worries were softened by the warmth that filled the room. She realized that sometimes, survival wasn't just about stretching food or enduring hunger, it was about the human connection that reminded her she wasn't invisible, that someone saw her struggle and cared enough to act. Amina sat for a long while by the window after tucking Sarah in, watching the city outside. Lights glimmered in distant apartments, some bright, some dim, each a story unfolding quietly in the night. She thought about the many people in the world who endured hardships unseen, and a quiet determination settled in her chest. She would survive, not just endure, because she now knew that help existed, that kindness existed, and that she wasn't alone. Mrs. Kareem had moved to sit back in her chair, sipping a small cup of tea she had brought for herself. She glanced at Amina, her eyes soft but steady. You'll see, she said, a small act of help can change everything. And one day, you'll be the one helping someone else, just as I helped you today. Amina smiled faintly, imagining a future where she could repay this kindness, where she could ensure no other child went to bed hungry in their small building, where hope could be shared like a ripple spreading through still water. She realized that hope was not a distant dream but something that could grow even in the smallest apartment, even in the darkest times, when someone reached out a hand. The night deepened, and Sarah slept soundly, a small smile lingering on her lips. Amina leaned back against the wall, her hands resting on her lap, feeling the warmth of the small meal, the laughter, and the connection that had entered their lives. She allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in days, letting go of the fear that had held her captive. Tomorrow might still bring struggles, she knew. There would still be challenges, still be worries, still be hunger at times. But tonight, they had food, they had safety, and most importantly, they had someone who cared. And that was enough to ignite a spark of hope that could grow into strength, resilience, and the belief that even in the darkest times, there were lights shining, waiting to be seen. As the night wore on, Amina whispered softly to herself, we are not alone. We are not alone. And for the first time in a long while, she truly believed it. This expanded scene too keeps the emotional depth, emphasizes Amina's reflection, and stretches the moment of hope and human connection to around 1,000 words. If you want, I can now create detailed image prompts for both Scene 1 and Scene 2, perfect for visual storytelling. Do you want me to do that?